Hello everyone! Welcome to the first of a new series of lore videos where we'll be delving into the lore of the old world. Or at least what we hope will be in the lore of the old world, so to speak. Something we need to briefly get out of the way is that everything in this video will be highly speculative, because to be frank, the old world is going to have a ton of retcons to the lore of Warhammer Fantasy, no matter what. Games Workshop changes the lore of their settings on a rapid basis, and it has been over 8 years since the Warhammer Fantasy setting was destroyed. That's a long time for new writers to come in and for tons of old information to become irrelevant or just frankly be forgotten. So don't take the lore we'll be delving into here as gospel, but rather as an exercise to see just how different the old world will end up being. Personally, I'm quite excited to see the retcons and additions, because new isn't always bad, but we'll just have to wait and see. In any event, let's turn our attention to the fair kingdom of Bretonnia and see what information we can figure out that, according to the old lore at least, should be relevant to the lady's lands. First and foremost, the most critical piece of information that we've received so far is that the king, when the old world begins, is one Louen, Orc-Slayer. This is a recognizable name from the old lore, so that's excellent news. According to the timelines we have available, King Louen Orc-Slayer ascended to the throne around 2201 of the imperial calendar, and famously declared an errantry war against the Greenskins. Reason being that the orcs and goblins had swelled in recent decades, making the dukedoms perilous to travel as the savages were pouring out from the forests and mountains. This war would ultimately prove to be incredibly successful, crushing the Greenskin tribes and pushing them out all across Bretonnia, which left the kingdom in a strong position. King Louen himself fought at the front of many of these battles, charging headlong into brutish hordes to slay in the lady's name. By the turn of the century, there were hardly any orcs left in Bretonnia. One piece of new information that the old world has already given, however, thanks to these fancy new old world maps, is that King Louen Orc-Slayer is also the Duke of Gaston, or at least hails from that duchy and seems to rule from Castle Gaston. But of course, it has been full-on confirmed that he is from Gaston, which is a nice confirmation. His heraldry has also been revealed as that of a red, fire-breathing dragon upon a field of white and gold with a blue fleur-de-lis in the upper left corner. As Gaston's traditional symbol is that of a dragon, referring to the mighty Smirgus slain by Jules le Breton, the first king of Bretonnia and once Duke of Gaston himself, this is quite appropriate. Perhaps Louen may be a direct descendant. In any event, that's certainly an exciting place to begin with Bretonnia as a headlining faction in the new setting. It doesn't give us much of an exact start date when I wrote this script, but now we know that the official start date is going to be 2276 of the imperial calendar, but we'll talk more about that in the video that follows after this one. So we don't know for sure when the Orc-Slayer lays down his sword and takes his last breath. His death, or when he steps down from the throne, is unrecorded. Considering that the old world will probably be building up to the Great War Against Chaos, which has its ultimate climax somewhere in the ballpark of 2302 to 2304, with the battles at the Gate of Kislev and some other events that take place around that, this gives us a good amount of years to work with. But we're going to go ahead and set that aside for now and just work on the information that the old lore provides us about things that may occur. So the next thing we need to tackle is the kings that come after Louen Orc-Slayer, but before the conclusion of the Great War. There are actually two that we know of, that being Jules the Just and Gaston de Beaugest. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to call that one Gaston, by the way, because that name is a mouthful. So, who are these other two rulers and what do we know about them? Jules the Just is most likely the king who takes the throne after Louen, though we can't say this for absolute certainty, as there isn't an official published timeline of every Bretonnian king there ever was. The good news is that we do know when Jules died, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. King Jules from the Duchy of Gisleroux was known as the Just, supposedly due to him being responsible for regulating the practice of death duels between rival knights, which up until that point had proven to be rather deadly affairs, as the name implies. With the consultation of the Fay Enchantress, the new law instituted by Jules, stated that all conflicts between knights during peacetime had to be à la plaisance, so using blunted weapons. There were knights who attempted to refuse this new decree, but they quickly found themselves cast out and shunned, being forced to undergo dangerous quests to restore their honor or face being exiled. In any event, this revolutionized the practice of jousting tournaments, combat trials, and duels of honor by ensuring those who participated would get to walk away, barring freak accidents or dishonorable skullduggery. Even the lofty grand tournaments adapted to fit these new guidelines, becoming far more chivalrous, while losing none of the entertainment value for both peasant and noble alike. Truly an impressive achievement for King Jules that cemented his reign as a wise and honorable one. I do say supposedly, however, as during the time of this video, the information that talks about this particular aspect of Jules' reign comes from White Dwarf article 215, which was published in November of 1997, which sadly I cannot find a copy either virtually or physically so that I can verify the information, so take what I just said with a little bit of a grain of salt. However, during this time of Jules' reign, not all was well in the wider world. While the Greenskins continued to falter beneath the ongoing errantry war declared by the prior king, terrible forces from the north began to test Bretonnia's defenses. The mortal followers of Chaos sailed out across the Sea of Claws, striking along the northern coastline to raid and pillage in the name of their dark gods. King Jules answered this challenge and rallied his armies while riding north. Upon the shores of fair Bretonnia, the gallant knights charged without fear into the hordes of chaos before them in a titanic battle to repel the taint from their lands. Jules the Just, living up to his name, fought fiercely until he finally found himself before the Chaos Champion leading the nightmarish horde. As of the current lore, this champion remains unnamed, but with this happening somewhere between 2280 to 2290 of the Imperial calendar, most likely, this was probably an immensely powerful warlord who sought the title of Everchosen, a rival to none other than Azavar Kul, trying to earn the favor of the Chaos Gods. King Jules faced off with this brutal champion, the two engaging in a legendary duel to determine the fate of the battle. In the end, the writing suggests that Jules fell first beneath the blade of his foe, but his sacrifice was not in vain, for his lance had struck a mortal blow that caused the Chaos Lord to collapse dead mere moments later. This successfully caused the invading horde to rout, without the iron will of their champion to force them onwards. Those brave knights still fighting pursued their foes, running them into the cold clutches of the sea. Bretonnia had been saved from the predations of chaos, but another threat, and one far more sinister, lay hidden. King Jules, unfortunately, had no male heir, only his daughter, La Belle Isolde. She could not be king. However, there was a tradition to handle this circumstance. Princess Isolde sent out a call across the entirety of Bretonnia that any knight who proved themselves worthy of the lady's approval would earn her hand in marriage, and thus the throne. This led to thousands of knights setting out all across the land in hopes of earning this great honor, while the dukedoms did their best to manage without a reigning king. However, none managed to succeed in locating the Grail during this time. Even worse, the Greenskins of the Grey Mountains were amassing in numbers not seen since the greatest battles of King Louen Orc-Slayer's errantry war, their raids growing bolder by the month. The true threat, however, turned out to be a sinister ploy from within the kingdom itself. For in the pursuit of power, two individuals had committed terrible sins. When King Jules fell in battle and his daughter initiated the quest for her hand, this provided a unique vulnerability to be exploited. If no one was able to locate the Grail and receive the blessing from the lady, then the power vacuum would start to destabilize the country. Bretonnia would be desperate for a hero to step up and take the throne, offering stability at long last. Guiding this scheme were the rulers of Mousillon, Duke Maldred and his sorceress consort Mauflair. The two were already married, so Maldred couldn't simply try to wed Princess Isolde. Thus, they settled on a different plan. The first key to the plot revolved around a dark and terrible secret, the sorceress Mousillon, who I'll do an entire focus video on later as there's a lot to discuss with her, had been sending out bands of dishonorable wretches to plunder burial mounds and ancient sites all around the Duchy of Mousillon. Among the various artifacts that were uncovered, it was an impressive chalice that drew Mousilion's eye. This would be her false grail, an item of horrific power, though how much of that came from Mousilion's tampering is hard to say. With the false grail secured, the second stage of the scheme began. Duke Maldred publicly declared that he would ride out on the grail quest to find the lady's favor, which in and of itself wouldn't raise suspicions. What did cause surprise, however, was how quickly Maldred returned to Mousillon, claiming that he has succeeded in the grail quest. Furthermore, he also had in his possession a miraculous chalice of unsurpassed beauty. Rumors spread rapidly throughout Bretonnia that the Lady of the Lake had gifted the Duke of Mousillon the Grail itself. Such a favor was unheard of, but many believe this to be a sign of the struggles that face their land in the coming years. Surely, Maldred had been marked out to be king. That left the most difficult step remaining, to silence the only detractors who could truly threaten Maldred's deception: the Fay Enchantress and the Grail Knights. The Duke understood this well, and thus had waited to perform his fate Grail quest until his opponents had already been occupied engaging the orcs pouring out from the Grey Mountains. Knowing they had to strike quickly before word reached the lady's champions of what had occurred, Mousillon used her sorcery to scry the Fay Enchantress's location so that Maldred could lead a band of thugs disguised as knights errant to find her. They managed to isolate and surround the Fay Enchantress, capturing her after a fierce ambush, mostly thanks to Mousilion's sorcery guarding against powerful magics. At least, according to some tales. In others, the Fay Enchantress was invited to attend Duke Maldred's court, who had till then been seen as a shrewd and honorable man. She accepted the offer to hear his concerns, but the feast thrown in her honor was poisoned and made her fall into a deathly slumber. In either case, the lady's representative was quickly escorted to the Donjon of Dole, a fell keep built in ancient times upon a high pinnacle of rock on the remote and desolate western coast of Mousillon. This dolorous structure served well as a prison for the Fay Enchantress, for between its unique construction by the elves centuries ago and Mousilion's enhancements, shall we say, the jail proved more than capable of containing the Enchantress's powerful magics. Here she would remain, the only bridge to the Donjon of Dole guarded by a horrific monster bound by Maldred's consort. The final step of Maldred's deceit was to host a tournament in Mousillon, inviting all to participate and enjoy the festivities. Many would come, no few drawn by the rumors of the chalice that the Duke claimed to possess from the lady herself. Sure enough, the artifact is displayed for all to marvel at, while Maldred and his impossibly beautiful wife entertain their guests. Only the Grail Knights, having supped from the true Grail, recognized the deceit for what it was. Their options were incredibly limited, however, for by chivalric code, they could not directly challenge Maldred unless the Fay Enchantress stripped him of his authority as Duke. Some went out searching for her, while others rode to Gaston to support Princess Isolde in what was to come. Having fallen for the well-crafted display, peasants and nobility alike began to clamor that Duke Maldred should be crowned king, for surely he had the lady's favor by bearing her sacred chalice. Some even going so far as to claim that his mysterious wife was none other than the lady herself. Perhaps that was why the Fay Enchantress had vanished. The goddess, having taken a mortal form, would no longer need a mere representative to be her voice in Bretonnia. The ploy had nearly succeeded. All Mousillon and Maldred required now was to claim the crown from Gaston. Aware that a sizable force loyal to Princess Isolde may oppose them, they gathered their armies and called upon those knights who had been deceived to ride alongside them. While turmoil and chaos, with a lowercase c, spread around Bretonnia, a young man questing for the Grail found himself assailed by visions. His dreams compelled him to ride west with all haste, barely stopping for rest, as a divine will whispered for him to push ever onwards till he arrived at the ocean. Gaston de Guest urged his steed along the rocky shores of Mousillon, scanning the horizon for a sign from the Lady of the Lake, who surely had called him here. He never allowed doubt to creep into his heart about this seemingly mad errand, continuing his search until at last he spied an ominous rock jutting out from the sea as if to impale the very sky. Riding closer, Gaston realized this was no mere outcrop, but a dolorous keep constructed of what looked like black rock. A lonely stone bridge stretched out from the shore to the ominous donjon of Dole, the narrow path radiating with sinister intent. As he considered the trial before him, Gaston spied a beautiful maiden wearing white in one of the tower's windows. At once, he knew something was awry and charged across the crumbling road without hesitation. The donjon of Dole loomed above Gaston as he drew near to the gate, shouting a challenge to the castellan, no doubt lurking within. The portcullis creaked open, and from within the shadows came a horrific monster. A colossal beast of flesh, scale, and tentacle that had been bound by Malflayer's dark sorcery to guard the captive within from all potential rescuers. Whether Jabberslythe or a chaos spawn of impressive size, either way, the creature would be a trial for an entire regiment of foes, let alone a single knight upon his loyal steed. Yet Gaston balked not, lowering his lance and roaring a cry to the lady as he charged. The duel is truly one of legend, and the details differ from telling to telling, but all agree how, in the end, Gaston de Guest's lance pierced the twisted heart of his foe. The donjon of Dole's foul warden let out one final shriek before it tumbled from the bridge to be dashed upon the rocks below. Victorious, Gaston rode straight into the fortress and up the spiral staircase without even dismounting to rescue the Fay Enchantress. Together, they galloped with all haste back across the bridge before it collapsed, having suffered too greatly during the contest between knight and monster. They rode without pause to meet up with several Grail Knights who had encamped outside of Mousillon's walls before carrying onwards to catch Maldred's army heading for Gissereau. The final battle had come, Duke Maldred riding alongside Malflayer with the false Grail in hand as they approached the loyalists who stood by Princess Isolde. The traitorous Lord of Mousillon demanded that he be given the crown of Bretonnia, for he possessed the Grail and even had taken the lady herself for his bride. Malflayer's mastery over enchantment and illusion made such a claim hard to argue, the loyalists nervously holding their ground. Then salvation arrived. The Fay Enchantress herself galloping between both armies and declaring Maldred a malefactor against the lady, stripped of his honor and dukedom. All of Bretonnia would declare war upon him if he did not immediately surrender and accept banishment. Instead of contrition, ex-Duke Maldred doubled down and defied the Fay Enchantress, claiming her to be simply envious of his newfound favor with the lady. He raised up the false Grail and called out for any who dared to meet him in single combat if they truly believed these lies. Both armies held their breath as silence dominated the battlefield. For while it was not the genuine article, the false Grail did radiate with incredible power. Gaston and the Grail Knights made to accept, but the Fay Enchantress commanded them to stay put, as another had already accepted this challenge. From the forest of Arden, just beside both armies, came charging a lone rider, glowing with an ethereal green light as the mists parted before him. Maldred's gloating face twisted into one of absolute terror as he witnessed none other than the legendary Green Knight tearing towards him with otherworldly speed. It was at this precise moment that the Lady of the Lake herself intervened, revealing the false grail for the tawdry trinket that it was. Whether by dispelling Malflayer's illusions or revealing the true grail for all to see, the stories don't quite agree on how it happens precisely. Either way, this proves too much for Maldred's army, who abandoned him, many horrified and ashamed at having fallen for his deceptions. The former Duke and his paramour also fled before the wrath of the Green Knight, retreating back to Mousillon with the help of Malflayer's sorcery and closing the gates behind them in preparation for siege. All of the other dukedoms in Bretonnia rally once more under a single banner, an immense army surrounding the city of Mousillon in the hopes of bringing the treacherous foes within to justice. Meanwhile, Gaston is recognized for his heroic efforts and sups from the Grail, though whether he did so at the final confrontation or later on isn't exactly clear. La Belle Isolde happily agrees to marry the savior of the Fay Enchantress, who of course receives the blessing of the lady's representative to be crowned king. King Gaston de Beaugest, as he was now known, turned his attention to dealing with Mousillon as the first act of his rule. He declared the duchy a wasteland, thereby stripping it of all rights as a dukedom, including any who once ruled there. The siege drags on, for even with superior numbers and blockading the city from receiving supplies, Mousillon's thick walls and defensible construction make it nigh impregnable. It didn't help that Maldred and Malflayer's considerable amount of questionable allies enabled them to sneak a consistent flow of supplies past the blockade. However, these were only used to entertain the nobility, who locked themselves within the main keep of the city to indulge themselves as certain doom loomed. The peasantry of Mousillon suffered horribly, subjected to brutal bombardments from siege weapons while also struggling with starvation and disease. The conditions continued to worsen for roughly 3 years until the final nail in the coffin came slamming down. The red pox returned. A nightmarish disease concocted by the Skaven of Clan Pestilence that centuries prior had decimated the population of Bretonnia. For the Ratmen had used it in an attempt to recreate the success of the infamous Black Plague, though the red pox proved far less effective. For the already weakened and dying people of Mousillon, however, there was no hope, as it tore through what remained of the defenders. The forces laying siege eventually noticed that the city had fallen eerily silent in that 3rd year. A small scouting party of knights, led by the Fay Enchantress herself, approached the city, pushing open the unguarded gate and finding what could only be described as a hellish scene within. Seemingly every last soul had perished. Man, woman, child. None had survived the ravages of the red pox. Every street and building choked with famished corpses. With the magics of the Fay Enchantress protecting them from contagion, the party approached the keep and found the scene inside much the same. Despite having sealed themselves in to avoid the plague, somehow the red pox had also infiltrated the nobility. The decadence on display contrasted with the obvious terror and madness that had taken over when the fattened nobles must have realized they were doomed to die slow, agonizing deaths. The most unsettling fate, however, was that of Maldred and Malflayer. The pair were found sitting in their thrones, desiccated and rotten in an unusual way. Their eyes were missing, as if plucked out, and no simple disease or blade had killed them. Something unspeakably foul had happened within the throne room, a mystery that would never be solved, as the Fay Enchantress ordered for the keep to be evacuated and every entrance bricked up. The corpses would remain as they lay, hopefully to never be disturbed again. To insert my own thoughts on the matter for a moment, between the sudden resurgence of the red pox and the bizarre deaths of Mousillon's royal duo, there is some notable suggestion that the Skaven were ultimately responsible for what happened. It is subtly implied in a few places that the Ratmen were involved in some fashion with the schemes of Maldred or Malflair, maybe both, but that's genuinely just a theory. So ends the affair of the False Grail. Gaston de Bogest would go on to reign as king throughout the events of the Great War against Chaos, though what exact actions he would take during this time remain unrecorded. This concludes the story of what Bretonnia was up to in the old lore for the timeline of when the old world will be taking place. I'm sure you were able to tell by a few notes throughout the story, but there have been several renditions of what exactly happened during the affair of the False Grail, so don't be surprised if you've read something slightly different elsewhere. The 5th edition army book, 6th edition army book, White Dwarf articles, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition books of Knights of the Grail and Barony of the Damned, and a now lost Games Workshop website blog page titled Affair of the False Grail all offer different nuggets of information that often compete or contrast one another. In any event, the time has come for us to wrap up this video. I hope you all enjoyed a deep dive into Bretonnia's perspective of events during this time period that will be taking place for the old world. If you're still thirsty for another sip from the lady's chalice, fear not, as tomorrow I'll be returning with another video about the same topic, except this time it'll be discussing all of the new lore we've already gotten about the old world relating to Bretonnia. It'll be, thankfully, much shorter than this video, but I think y'all will find it quite interesting nonetheless. I'm personally really looking forward to seeing just how much Games Workshop will keep versus retcon for the new setting. Here at the end of the video, I do want to take a brief moment to thank all of my wonderful patrons over on Patreon for their support. There are no words to express my bottomless thanks for y'all's generosity. Truly, I cannot thank you enough. For those of you who haven't checked it out, I've started working on uploading exclusive content to Patreon, so things that just wouldn't work on YouTube or would get smacked for being on YouTube. So please consider checking out what's on there. Even $1 a month helps more than you know, as ad revenue on YouTube ain't what it used to be. Real quick, I do want to give a special shout out to Eric, Scion of the Emperor, Eckhardiothalion, Hologam, Squats, and Mr. Vorn for their particularly generous support of building new Grail chapels in the lady's name. Heroic Grail Knights, one and all. Anyway, that does it for me on this one. See you all tomorrow for some shiny new old world lore. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Bye.